I hope you enjoyed the first video. Let's now start with the first practical case related to the single contract model. As a reminder, if you apply a supply scenario tone initial POD that has been configured to fulfill the single contract model, one installation and one contract will be created. One or several non-billable services could also be created according to your settings in the configuration of the supply scenario. Let's see how it works in the system. I am currently logged in the SAP system. In order to use the supply scenario, I always need a point of delivery. This is the starting point. Let's have a look to the POD that will be used. This POD has been created upfront but is a brand new POD. In order to display the POD, I have to enter transaction EEDM11 display POD. I have to select the POD. In order to do this, I click on the POD tab in Select Object part of the screen. I enter the POD ID. The POD that will be used in this demo is called ttrade1. The POD will be displayed below. I double-click on it. The POD is displayed on the right side of the screen. When looking at this POD, I can see that no master data has been allocated to it. Please note that this POD is a deregulated POD. Furthermore, the grid and grid level have been assigned. This determines the distributor. The allocation tab is empty. This means that no installation nor register have been linked to this POD. If you look to the POD service tab, you will see that no non-billable service is allocated to the POD. Finally, the supply scenario tab is also empty. This means that this POD has never had any valid billable contract and that no supply scenario has ever been applied to this POD. I will now apply a supply scenario to this POD. In order to achieve this, let's move to the Customer Interaction Center. I close this transaction using /n and open the Customer Interaction Center using CICO, transaction code in the command field. I'm in the Customer Interaction Center. As mentioned in the previous video, we can retrieve all processes related to the supply scenario in the Deregulation tab. To apply a supply scenario or change a supply scenario to a POD, we have to use the Change Supply Scenario process. Let's click on this process. I have to fill in all required data. This starts with the business partner. As mentioned in the introduction video, the business partner is a prerequisite. Let's select Business Partner 213. This has little importance for the demo. I enter our point of delivery, ttrade1. Then we enter the start date, which is the 1st January of 2014. This start date will be the start date of the selected supply situation. As consequence, it determines the start date of the billable and non-billable services. It also determines the date of the move-in and/or move-out documents that will be generated during the process. I finally enter the supply scenario that has been configured to correspond to the single contract model. In our system, it's supply scenario 10. Then I have to execute. I have to mention the external service provider that will supply the energy. This data is necessary in order to create the contract and the non-billable services. Let's select SUPP1_E. E stands for electricity and click on execute. Then I have to select the premise. The premise is also a prerequisite of the process. You could imagine to use a master data template that creates a premise during the process if no premise has been created up front. Let's select premise 5 7 times 0 3 0. The premise has little importance in the demo. The premise is of course needed to install the installation. Then I execute. Now it's time to enter some parameters related to the distribution installation, such as the rate category, the meter reading unit and the billing class. Other parameters have been defined as constants in the master data templates we use to create the master data. You can of course add parameters to this screen thanks to some additional configuration. This solution is really flexible. Again, we execute. Last data to be entered, the payment class. This field is mandatory when the service provider and invoicing service provider are different. It determines the payment process and the payment frequency between those two actors. It's used during the creation of the contract. Let's select 3x01. Again, the choice of the data has little importance for the purpose of this demo. Let's execute. This is probably the most interesting screen to analyze. Let's see which objects have been created. We can see that one installation has been created with service type 3x01 for distribution. One contract has also been created for service provider DIST_E. This service provider is determined from the grid entered in the POD. A move-in document has also been created, which makes the link between businesses and technical master data. Besides this, two non-billable contracts have been created, one for the supply of electricity and one for the settlement coordination. The external energy supplier has been entered manually during the process, while the settlement coordinator has been derived from the grid used in the POD. Finally, we can see that supply scenario 10 has been applied correctly to POD T-Trade 1. A last remark. No contract account has been created in this case because a contract account was already existing for the business partner we use in our example. Otherwise, a contract account would have been created. If a business partner has more than one contract account, the system will automatically select the one for which the relationship between the business partner and the contract account is account holder. The account holder relationship, indeed, can only be assigned to one business partner per contract account. In the second demo, we will use business partner without contract account to check the automatic creation of a contract account. Let's move to the POD T-Trade 1, again in order to check if everything is correct. I therefore enter /NEEDM11 in the command field to move directly to the display POD transaction. I select our POD T-Trade 1 and double-click on the POD in order to display it. In the allocation tab, we can see that things have evolved. The installation with service type 3x01 for distribution is created and installed in the selected premise. The division is 01 for electricity. As previously mentioned, the supply scenario is division specific. Let's check the installation by clicking on it. We can now see the parameters I have entered during the supply scenario process: billing class 3x01, rate category E1, and meter reading unit annual. The service type of the installation is indeed 3x01 for distribution. Let's now go back to the POD. In the POD Service tab, you get the list of non-billable services with their service type, division, and service provider. In the Supply Scenario tab, we can see that Supply Scenario 10 has been applied to the POD to build up the data model for a single contract model. You can also see the different contracts that have been created. We have one billable contract managed in our system and two non-billable services managed in external systems. Let's now have a look at the billable contract. I see the link with the contract account in the first tab, and I see the service provider, the invoicing service provider, and the payment class. This one is mandatory when the service provider and the invoicing service provider are different. As we have seen during the demo, by applying Supply Scenario 10 to the POD, I have created one installation with service type 3x01 for distribution, one billable contract with a distributor as service provider and with a supplier as invoicing service provider. Besides this, I also created two non-billable services for the supply of electricity and the settlement coordination. As expected, I was able to create a single contract model in one single process. This ends the first demo and second video about the supply scenario. Thank you for your attention.